Hello, this is John Costa at the Documentary Media Centre, and this year for the 3rd of December, we're going to do the United Nations International Day of Persons with Disabilities event, a showroom, and I'm absolutely delighted that my co-host for this event this year is Sarah Reilly, who's the Director of the Women's Research Centre here as well. So good morning to you, how are you?
Yeah, I'm grand. Thank you for putting this on for us at the Documentary Media Centre. That's sort of hosting it there as well, which is brilliant.
No problem.
And yeah, but I think it's really important that we kind of mark today and everything, particularly because of a lot of changes that have happened this year. So I think, yeah, it's definitely good that we're highlighting sort of people with disabilities at the moment.
I mean, as a freelance journalist, but also someone who teaches communications, the communication arts, and also media production, like communication challenges at the university, I think this year's really made people think about the way that we communicate, and also, are we being as inclusive and as accessible as we could be, or should be, should I say, as well, for people in the community. Now, I'm thinking of like social distancing. I'm thinking of the impact of a webinar I ran last week around for action deafness, around making sure that we had captioners as well as signers, and how do you use Zoom, and we're using Zoom for this call obviously today. I'm also thinking of people wearing masks when it comes to people that lip read. So I think it's great that combining that with this year's theme of hidden disabilities, that actually communications becomes something that we really focus on and think about. And that leads us to our guest, who I will leave you to introduce.
Well, maybe Molly should introduce herself though as well. Exactly. So this is like Molly O'Brien. Welcome to the Women's Research Centre and the Documentary Media Centre. I'll let you introduce yourself, as we all kind of have our sort of phrases and everything.
Well, I'm Molly, as Sarah said. I know Sarah from when I was at university in Nottingham. I have a disability myself. I have a dual sensory impairment, with a visual impairment and a hearing impairment. So parts of my disability, I say, are quite hidden, and then parts of it are quite overt, depending on the situation that you're in. And I also work at a charity called Definitely Women, which is local to Derby and Derbyshire, where we are run by and for deaf women themselves.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us, as we said earlier. Just sort of thinking straight off about the access of things. I remember kind of back when we were at the university and working within the Disabled Students Network. I know sort of then, like how many years ago now? What, 6, 7 years ago now?
8 years ago now?
Oh, no. Because I'm trying to make it short. No, not really. It's fine. I know that then we were kind of like discussing issues such as like access to like with lectures, kind of a lot of people then were kind of weren't very open to the idea of even kind of having sort of their captions or subtitles on lectures, or not everybody would always use the hearing loops and everything kind of at the centre, and just sort of other aspects like flashing fire alarms and that sort of thing. So I know we tried to highlight that at the time, but how were your sort of experiences? And then obviously then we can bring it into today, where, you know, obviously with COVID, everything's kind of suddenly gone online, sort of thing.
And I think actually for me, the issue of access really came to the fore at university. I experienced it so much, and I felt that so many, I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but so many people have a very narrow view of what access is, in a very physical, visual sense, like, oh, we put a ramp in, that's great, it's accessible. And it's quite a narrow-minded view, in a sense that, of course, a ramp is very important for various disabilities, and often very physical disabilities that it's more obvious to see. But it's the broader picture of access, and that's when I first started noticing at university. I'd go into lecture hall, and I'd find that the hearing loop wouldn't work. And it's like, how was I meant to be able to hear what a lecturer is saying from halfway up the lecture theatre? And then the other factor is, like, some lecturers like to walk and talk, which means that you walk away from a microphone, you don't pick up the sound. And it's just
that's what I do. I'm guilty of that, I'm afraid. Yeah.
No, but then if you have personal hearing loops, the ones that like clip onto somebody, it doesn't matter, you can still walk and talk, which is what I eventually managed to get through my Disabled Students Allowance funding. So it was like brilliant when you could actually have a lecture theatre where they had a working hearing loop, and then I would ask a lecturer to wear my own hearing loop as well. And there was like double the amount of what I could hear. And then you could get that access in that respect. So once you actually got both pieces of technology working, it was getting the access. It was getting access to that technology, but constantly worked. It was often the issue. But it's quite interesting. But it was interesting that a lot of people, from my perspective, never thought of hearing loops as something that was an important part of access. And it was often something that was forgotten about, because it's not, I think, partly because it's a hidden, because some people often think deafness is more of a hidden aspect. Because for me, a lot of people say that they can't always tell that I'm deaf. But without my hearing aids, I've got a severe hearing loss, and I don't hear anything unless someone speaks to my ear. Because I also use a white cane when I'm walking, so it's quite obvious that I've got a vision loss. But then my cane's got red on it as well, which does symbolise deafness or hearing loss. It's not very well known publicly, so even though that visual symbol is there, it's not one that's widely known. So people will assume I've got some level of vision loss, obviously from the white cane, but then the hearing loss is often what's apparently hidden in that context. It's situational for me in that respect. It really is very situational at the moment.
Can I ask you a question, Molly? I mean, from an education point of view, sort of maybe not so much primary school, but secondary school, did you go to a specialist school for your hearing loss, or was it mainstream education?
It was mainstream, but it had a specialist provision for hearing loss. Because at that time, my hearing loss was more the priority of my vision, because my vision loss is degenerative. So even though I've always had a sight loss, it got worse over the years. So the focus from an educational point of view was hearing at that time. So even though it was mainstream, we had specialist communication support workers and then working in the school with us, which it worked to an extent. It did the job. It did mean that I had to travel outside of my local area, so I didn't go to a secondary school with my local peers, for example. Though travelling 20 miles out of your area is not very normal for a 12-year-old at the time. So it was an experience, and there were positives and there were negatives. I think that will always be the case, whatever school you go to. But the support for the hearing loss was more a priority than the vision. I wish, looking back, there was more visual assistance, but I don't think the school probably had the resources or the funding in place for it. I mean, I was made to do hockey and PE. I can't see it. I'm surprised I only had about 2 injuries in 5 years there.
Yeah, and I've always found mixed hockey is probably the most dangerous sport I've ever done anyway. So therefore, I don't know what it was. Girls had laser eyes when it came to actually being able to find the gap between your ankle bone and the back of your leg. So it was very good at doing the injuries. Yeah.
So it's like jumping and waving a stick to try and stop the ball from going past you or hitting your ankles at the same time. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the reason I asked that, Molly, really was because we talk a lot about, don't we, about people in society being unaware of the red stripes on your white stick. So most people would see the white stick and assume, obviously, vision impairment, probably thinks to themselves, oh, I wonder what the red stripes mean. I wonder if that's just for show, like you would do on your car, make it go faster. So I think...
Because that's the thing, the big thing about some vision impaired people love coloured canes. I understand why, because they like them to show their personality. Like I know I've seen various stuff online, people might have a purple cane or a yellow cane, and it's just to show their personality. But from somebody who uses the red on the cane to try and symbolise something, it can be annoying. Because I'm trying to symbolise what something means, whereas another member of the public who may not be so much in the know might think that purple means something, but it doesn't. It just means that someone thinks purple reflects their personality, which is wonderful for that person, but annoying for me.
Yeah, because it's how do we build this into education, isn't it? So that, for example, we would expect someone to do a driving test, both, a theory one and a practical one, but we don't really have that kind of element of people being able to then understand people in society or those that are around them, particularly if education is about division and putting people into specialist education in order to provide for them. But at the same time, what that does is it kind of takes those kind of people out of the mainstream, so that the mainstream, for the first time, they might come across someone with a visual impairment and also who has an audio impairment like yourself, is at university or in the workplace. So in fact, you've almost gone like 18 years of your life without being aware that there's other people that are affected by these unless they're in the family. And so really, this is, I suppose, one of the key things, isn't it, about the International Day? It's not the only time to think about it. We need to be turning around and saying, well, who's doing good stuff around the inclusion of people into society going on? I suppose COVID-19's really come along and thrown a hand grenade into that whole thing, isn't it? Where suddenly it's affected everybody. So what do we do now? This is the ideal opportunity to do something now, isn't it? I mean, Sarah, we've spoke about this quite a lot, haven't we? About various times when we've been looking at some of the international stuff that we've been doing as well, where there's some really good work that's been done, some real kind of light bulb work that's being done overseas, shining, you know, good stuff into the dark. It's how we take some of that learning and start putting it out in a way that it's accessible for people to find, I guess, as well, isn't it? For those that want to be finding out that information.
I think about, like, sorry, Sally.
And after you next, Gran.
No, I was just saying, like, think about the changing in COVID. There's so many classes that are available online for people to access to from their own home, which for someone like me, if you find something that is auditory accessible, that's brilliant. But it also gets rid of the barrier of travel to get to places, because of having a vision loss, obviously I can't drive, it'd be a bit dangerous if I did. And you've got the practical issues of getting to places when you want to access an event or access a class, that you can do it from home. In some ways, it's quite beneficial because you don't have to worry about issues of travel and find your way around. But then you've got the other side of it. It's like for a lot of people who experience, it's still that increased isolation, even though you might see someone on a screen or you might hear someone on a screen. It's weighing up the benefits, and that's the bad side of it, is you still are at home on your own or with your family, but you can get access to things that maybe you probably wouldn't have done before, because there's some barriers that have been removed by doing things online, but then you've still got some communication issues. For me personally, still exist online. Like, I tried a couple of exercise classes online, even though they're advertised as auditory led and specifically for people who are visually impaired in mine, which is brilliant. However, the sound quality isn't clear enough for somebody like me with a hearing loss. So it's frustrating, and I think that's something that, as someone with a dual sensory loss, I experience quite a lot in terms of maximum vision for people with sight loss. But often the fact that I have a hearing loss is a factor, or it's hidden, if you want to use that word and think of it from that perspective. And the same the other way around, if you like deafness, a lot of organisations or focus on hearing loss is very much visual content and doesn't always work, or it uses predominantly sign language. And even though I have a basic knowledge of sign language and I have quite a good understanding of it, as you can tell, speech is my first language, sign language is not. And yeah, it's a difficult one.
Do you think it's also because of most systems being designed for the many, what happens then is that as soon as you get pushed further and further to the fringes, you're always having to compromise your level of access, aren't you? Because it's almost like, well, it's your fault that you can't access it.
Yeah, I always call myself niche.
Niche.
Yeah, I do laugh about it. I'm in a niche category, or I have a niche access requirement. And I think it might be to do with having a combination of conditions, or dual condition, or multiple conditions, whatever term you want to use, is that your access requirements and communication needs become more tailored to you. Because even though I might class myself as deafblind, if you take another deafblind person, their communication needs are very, very different from mine. Somebody might use hands-on sign language and have no hearing whatsoever. Some people might have no vision but have quite a lot of usable hearing, so will be more auditory. And yet, all of those people will call themselves deafblind, but would have very different communication and access needs depending on the combination of what their hearing and vision is. And that's why I probably call it niche. But it is, like you said, it's away from the mainstream. And it's away from whatever that mainstream may be, whether that is fully sight and full of hearing, or whether that is in a deaf world or a blind world. They're the mainstream that sometimes people don't always fit into. And I think of myself in that way at times.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Do you also find then as a younger person with like kind of multiple or a couple of disabilities really, do you tend to find that kind of also compounds the problem? Because I think often if you're an older person with hearing loss, and then often you have other health conditions that go alongside, I suppose people would view things quite differently than if you're a younger person. Like, I know from personal experience, when I pull into a blue badge bay, people always look because they think younger person can't be, well, somebody under the age of 70 can't, possibly have a blue badge or something, So, I mean, how do you find that in your everyday life as well? People just don't realise, yeah.
I think it's a very different experience growing up with a condition. I mean, my condition is genetic, so for me, this is how I've always been. It's my normal for me. And I've grown up this way, and it's a different experience. I think if you acquire a condition in later life, it's very different. If you have multiple conditions in old age, for example, it's very different. But then I also think if you've grown up with a condition like mine, and then obviously as you grow up when you get older, you've always been that way. I think there may be an assumption that it's because you're older. And I've seen it in some people I know who've had their condition from when they were younger. But I do think it's like, I've had personal questions asked me of strangers going, oh, will you start to get better? And I just think, this person doesn't even know my name and had just asked me if my sight will get better. And I remember being really annoyed. I think I was buying a new mobile phone, and it was just the sales assistant just asked me that question, and I thought, totally inappropriate, and I was so annoyed that day, but I just bluntly went, no, it's called a degenerative condition. And I just wondered why that question was asked. I thought, well, as a young person, and people assume that things will get better for you because you're younger. I don't know, maybe I'm making a lot of judgments. No, I know that same day I did get new hearing aids. They'll probably feel annoyed that I've got a new hearing aid. It's the only time I got to buy my phone, and this sales assistant thinks they can ask me a personal question. Lovely.
No, I think that's really true though. I think often like people do like say, notice your cane or mine or something, and you almost feel sometimes people do seem to want to know. You're like almost like kind of open access because you've got these visual symbols, and people just want to know a lot of information, like taxi drivers all the way through to, as you said, like shop assistants and everything. And I think that can be quite frustrating as well, particularly you know, if you do have a condition that does change or is degenerative or something. Often you sort of think, well, why should I tell you about this? What are you going to tell me your personal issues, you know, when you're asking my personal questions? And I think that's definitely it can be a very sensitive thing. And obviously it's important that we talk about disability though. I mean, obviously that is really important, but obviously there's a difference between talking about disabilities and sort of highlighting our experiences to try and kind of enact change and improve things, against the side of not necessarily wanting the whole of yourself to be kind of public or to have that kind of that barrier crossed, if that makes sense.
Completely. Yeah, because I think some days like I'm fine talking about it, like today, not a problem. I can talk about it, but get me on a bad day, I'll just sit and cry. Yeah,
I guess it's
and also
context.
this is the space.
I guess it's context, isn't it? It's you know, no one would come up to me like when I was buying a sausage cob earlier and go to me, oh, you're wearing glasses, you know, are your eyes getting worse? You know, how long you worn glasses for? And you go, well, you'd never ask me that. So I guess it's that, isn't it? It's about timing, context. Also, I think you have to take into account a lot of nervousness around people that they don't perceive as being like them or normal. I know we had a good chuckle about this, didn't we, when we were having our preparatory conversation last week for this call. You know, well, what is normal? I've never really met a normal person. You know what I mean? They're just as messed up as everybody else. Everybody's got different versions of whatever normal is. And I think that for me is one of the things that was really interesting about doing this webinar last week for Action Deafness, for example, is that because no one's ever specifically done anything for the deaf community as they got older, what you'll find is that the person, because of their deafness and their needs, will go into a care home or some kind of facility like that, where they then can't communicate. So they've got one part of their need being taken care of, but then no one's communicating with them in BSL. So this kind of extra care provision came about like that. And of course, if you then get things like sight loss or dementia plays into that as well, what then happens is they'll treat the first thing that comes up and you'll go into a home for that. Yeah. But then your other needs aren't getting dealt with. And I think that's really what the idea behind extra care was. And there was a guy on the call, was on the panel, who was an architect who is actually profoundly deaf himself. And of course, what came out talking to the various housing providers and specialists and policy advisors was the fact that there is no design guide built for people with deafness. So obviously that was an area for him to get into, was to create the template for other housing builders to be able to move on. And I think it's always that kind of, you feel like the situation is back on you to be the person that's either the poster person or the person to come up with that solution. You go, well, why aren't we being included? I'm sure if you work, Molly, then you pay tax like everybody else. And well, what's my tax being used on then? Keeping everything else inaccessible for me. Where is that being taken into account? Is this one of the things that you think about?
I think I do. I think when it comes to access, I know what you mean about it comes on the people themselves who want to be able to access it. I'm not wording it very well, but I know what you're trying to say. It's like if you've got the experience of inaccessibility for whatever, or you want to be able to make something more suitable for similar people like you, it does automatically fall on you, because some mainstream views and mainstream sectors don't see it from that point of view, because I don't mean it in a selfish way. I think a lot of mainstream organisations just see it from their perspective. They're not being selfish in that way. They just have their own perspective of looking at things and getting things done. It's like, my example is, I often get asked if I can manage the stairs, if I can walk upstairs, and I can. Yeah, my legs let me walk upstairs. It's my eyes that don't work. And I used to get so annoyed of being asked that question. And it was till a friend of mine pointed out, majority of people that are asking you that question are probably doing it from the point of view of, oh my gosh, how would I manage if I couldn't see? How would I go upstairs? And that's like a mainstream way of thinking. And yeah, it's from my perspective, it just seemed a bit ludicrous. And I just think, well, yeah, I can go upstairs. That's fine. My legs work okay for me. And I can understand why they would ask that to other people who can't. That's fine. But I heard what I'm trying to say, like, if you've got mainstream ways of thinking or perspectives on things, it does sometimes require people who have the more, if you want to think about it, niche experience or more disability-related experience, to develop those tailored packages in a way, or approach to making things more accessible. I hope I've expressed that correctly. A bit wordy.
No, definitely. I think that's really true. And I suppose yeah, exactly. It's kind of how people approach things once they get the personal experience, or kind of think, yeah, exactly, how would I sort of deal with that and everything. But I think something that I think there's a couple of points there, as we've already mentioned, kind of if you do have like intersecting identities or disabilities, then often people, as you say, will deal with one aspect of it, and then, like, rather than look at you as a whole person, they kind of try and look at each individual one. And then obviously charities often have their area that they're specialists in, and they won't necessarily, and they'll help you with that aspect, but not with all the other things that can connect. But I think also just sort of the other point is, like, how many of these things should just be default? Like, you're on about kind of building new houses, John. It's like, well, shouldn't all houses be built kind of accessible to begin with? Not just, I mean, generally they're not built with wide enough door frames for people in a wheelchair, but also should they have like sort of smoke alarms that kind of cater, like a flash as well as kind of ring or something, or you know, there's kind of quite a lot of things, particularly
it's like what you're saying with smoke alarms. If you want an accessible smoke alarm, you have to go and specifically apply for one. And if you want a page of it attached to it, which is what I have access to, it vibrates, again, you have to apply for one. It doesn't just come with an automatic thing, because I can't hear high-pitched frequencies at all. So fire alarms is something that I don't hear. Or I might hear a faint bit of a noise and thinking, oh, is that a fire alarm? Should I be worried? But it's just like, fire alarms in your own home is incredibly safe, and it should be a safety feature, but it's an additional add-on to a house. It's not something that comes when you need it. You have to wait for years to get it.
Of course, because I know we obviously talk about, I know John and I have, and I've spoken with you about how often a lot of people who are in disability community regards people who are without disabilities as not yet disabled. Yep. And I think ultimately, like, shouldn't we just have the baseline as being accessible for everybody? Like, look at the like Crossrail in London. That isn't automatic. That's a new line, and that isn't automatically accessible. They don't like every station should be step-free access, as well as covering kind of all the other sort of disabilities in relation to that. And even something like that, it's just astounding that today we're still not kind of taking that. Let's just make society accessible kind of thing.
You think in 2020 that should be a default?
Yes, exactly.
And, I think, you know, again, I was talking to some of these people on this webinar last week about deafness, and I just said, well, you know, is it the responsibility of journalists or those that teach journalists to turn around and say, well, actually, you need to find out more rather than jump into the stereotypes of what these people are or how they want to be described. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I think they were saying in Germany, all architects now just make doors wider. So, you know, that's an access for everybody, whether you're injured with a double buggy, with, you know, a broken leg, an older person with a Zimmer frame, and someone in a mobility scooter or in a wheelchair. How is it that we're still at the point in 2020 where we're still designing things for the mainstream or what people consider the normal, and it doesn't include everybody? That's what I don't understand. How can they build the Leicester Tigers Stadium a couple of years ago and not put a change in places in it, when they know there's funding available, when they've been spoken to throughout the whole thing, and they build it and it still doesn't have a change in places? That's outrageous. I mean, that's just, when we used to do an event there, we used to have to get a mobile version of the change in places in the back of a lorry and put that outside. The ultimate indignity. Bye, thanks for coming. Oh no, I'm just going out to use the changing places mobile loo in the transit van over there, and then I'll be back.
Exactly, you're kind of othered with that, aren't you? You're just othered with that as well. It has to be really obvious that's what you're doing, exactly, and that's really frustrating and stuff. And I think, and we shouldn't still be having these conversations, as you said. I mean, like the Disability Discrimination Act, which obviously has just had its big anniversary and everything. We shouldn't, you know, what was it, 25 years since that came out? There's sort of a couple of weeks back. And still today, as you said, 25 years later, after reasonable adjustments were introduced and into kind of legislation, we're still talking about these things now, and it's just, how are we not beyond this? It's astounding.
I guess it's to the point when people, I think a lot of organisations hide behind the fact that we can't change old buildings. But it's like you said, why are we building new buildings that aren't accessible for all? And why aren't we doing our best to change old buildings? I mean, I still remember my secondary school was quite an old building, and the part where my form room was the darkest part of the building, and they couldn't get a light in there to enable me to be able to see, because I can't see in low lighting or darkness. They got a permanent one in there, then the lovely student decided to smash it. And I still remember the difficulty every day of walking through a dark building that I couldn't see. And the school's line was, oh, it's an old building, we can't do anything about it.
Right.
But why can't we try our best to alter older buildings? I appreciate some of them you're never going to be able to do anything with. It's just the history and it's the just architecture of them are very difficult to alter. But then, like you said, newer buildings, why aren't we trying to make them more adaptable and flexible and more accessible for as many people as possible, rather than going, oh, we'll make it for the mainstream and then we'll just add on bits as and when we need to make it accessible. It frustrates me.
I've got a question for both of you. Here we go. Now,
I always worry.
Yeah, here we go. I'm on it now. I'm on it 3 hours later. I think that the Paralympics, one, they didn't expect it to be successful. Okay. And therefore, they missed the opportunity to give every school kid extra summer holiday and free tickets to go to the Paralympics, and then build in not just understanding about the event, obviously, fantastic event, but also to roll out a program of talking about access for all and, you know, hidden disabilities and all this sort of stuff. You know, we've missed that opportunity now where, and I suppose austerity came along and kind of pretty much attacked everybody at the bottom and those on the fringes as well, didn't it, really? So that's another more political thing. But I mean, from that point of view, do you think education is still the way that we're going to be able to make more people aware of things like hidden disabilities and stuff like that? Are we wasting our time with adults? Should we be focusing and campaigning to get schools, if not fully accessible, which I'd like to think with some of these building schools for the futures programs, they probably are more than ever before. That, you know, maybe we need some sort of lobbying at the point of view where we're putting things into education, where things like citizenship and stuff like that, you know, it needs to be coming at it from the point of view about learning about everybody. Molly?
I think, for me, there's a couple of things. Think about school building. I saw something on the news earlier this year with the whole COVID situation and lockdown. A lot of schools were getting improvement to their building because of the lockdown and because of the virus. And they've been lobbying for the alterations, like to stop flooding in their roof, for example. And I thought, why is it taking a virus to try and improve school safety buildings? That's from a safety point of view. So sometimes I think if we can change things now for the virus, what could we possibly do to change the building to be more accessible? Not just for the students, but also for the teachers and for the parents that might go in. So I think in some ways, there's no reason why we can't, other than finances, obviously, make it accessible in terms of a physical building. And I think in terms of education, looking at just education for children and whatnot, for me, when it comes to using my cane, I've lost track of the number of times that little children, like under the age of 10, will come up to me, obviously prior social distancing, and gone, what's that for? In a very loud voice. And you can almost feel the parents wanting to go, oh no, I'm so sorry they asked it. And I've like, when I've been with my mum, she told me that's sometimes what parents have said if I've not heard them afterwards. And I have no problem whatsoever with children asking me what my cane is, what it's for, because they want to know, they want to understand. And I even had a little boy once kind of wanted to have a go with it. and I wasn't going to give him my cane myself, but I let him hold it with me. It was a good 2 years ago now, and he loved it. And his mum at first was really apologetic, and I think that's a very adult thing. You don't ask questions, and you don't. It's very British as well. Like, you don't ask these questions, you just don't do anything about it. And for me, children are very receptive as you tell them something about it. And it's the same with my hearing aid. And it's like, I've had children ask me what my hearing aids are. I know a couple of my friends have got younger cousins, and she'd ask me about my hearing aid from like the age of 4. So I would teach her about it, and it became her normal. It just becomes normalised that you know somebody who's got a hearing aid. And like, if I'm able to teach her a basic A, B, C and do the alphabet in sign language, then she will hopefully remember that in years to come as an adult, and she's grown up with it as being normal. That's just an example. So like, you can, in a way, children are really receptive to it. It's a good opportunity to teach them. Whereas like, I think sometimes some adults are very reserved and don't want to ask the question when it comes to a disability. Not all of them, obviously. I appreciate I'm making a big generalisation, but it's just my experience with when kids want to know. They want to know what a cane is, they want to know what a hearing aid is, they want to know what hearing aid means. And just, I think it's fascinating from that perspective.
Sarah?
No, I definitely agree with that one, definitely. I think if we kind of, I think you're completely right, actually. Often it's adults who kind of, they're the ones who attach the kind of, not really shame, but I think it's all sometimes though the fear of thinking that could be me in years time as well. And I think that's often why that their mortality, you face your mortality, a lot of adults do. But again, like, I think it's great when kids ask, you know, like my little nieces and nephews, great, you know, have a look at like, you know, my different kind of the things I use to get around, I'll just say, or something. I think that's great. And I just think that's really important that we do have these conversations, and you know, and we're open about these conversations. I'm not saying, obviously, we've already talked about, I don't necessarily want to give my kind of like background story to kind of, you know, somebody I've just met either. It is that balance, but you know, we should be open to talk about these sort of things, definitely. But I think often though, things aren't led from the top, and that's really frustrating. And I think often people, like, it's not just the kind of I know it's important that we do start with children and we kind of get children to understand these things, but ultimately you do still have to hit the people who are in kind of in control of society. So to sort of link into COVID, there's actually a judicial review in a couple of the cases coming through by the fact that the news bulletins introduced by sort of for COVID by Boris Johnson, there isn't a BSL interpreter. And there is in Scotland, there is in Wales, there's 2 in Northern Ireland to cover both BSL as well as ISL, but we just don't have it here. And as I said, there's 2 judicial reviews, and even the big lockdown speech that was kind of, you know, sort of the start of November, that didn't even have a BSL interpreter.
It frustrates me so much when I'm not a sign language user, and I know a few of my colleagues where I work were very frustrated, and it would hold a campaign, where is the interpreter?
Yeah, exactly. It's a really big campaign. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah.
And it's just, I think, why, and I know sometimes the government response was, oh, there's captions. But we all know live captions aren't perfect, they're good. But also, for a lot of people that are sign language users, as their first language, their English skills are not at the same level as their sign language. So sometimes their reading level can be what we class as a 7-year-old, because they just don't have the English skills that people who English is their first language is sign language. So how do you expect them to keep up with captions on what I hate to say, that government jargon and language can be very difficult to follow, even if English is your first language.
Exactly.
For some people, and then you have that translated into sign language, and sign language would be so much more straightforward and easy for a lot of sign language users to understand and grasp. It's so much more to the point, and it's so much more accessible for those that use that language as their first form of communication. I mean, how would we feel if all of a sudden the news was in a different language that we couldn't understand, and we were trying to keep up with the English subtitles? It flip it on that point of view, and people would start to understand it more. But I got so frustrated from my fellow colleagues and women and others that use sign language, and just knowing the frustration that they must have felt for not being able to access that.
No, that's really true. And also just kind of like because often they jump between slides. You can't just watch the person who's talking. They're always kind of like, next slide, please. And they go through the different slides. And there's so much information you're having to take in as well.
Yeah.
You know, and again, it's like, why haven't we just done that as a baseline? You know, I think often with disabilities, it's like another characteristic that people have. I think that's often what I think of it. Like, it's as in, it's kind of a part of me as much as like my hair colour kind of thing.
Yeah.
But, you know, kind of thing. It's it's something that is there, and I think that it should just be a baseline for everything and everybody. It's just a characteristic. Why aren't we, and I think also just the fact, it's not as if other people have shown that it can't be done. It can, like, so many, as I just said, like the other kind of nations within the UK, they're sort of leaders, if you will, have used it as an interpreter. Obviously New Zealand, even like certain states in America and everything. And I suppose if it was the first time and then they've kind of caught up and thought, oh, we should have thought about that. But the fact is that, it's a long time since March, and in November they still haven't got it, and that's just disgraceful.
I just can't believe that still happened. I mean, it's like, when you go back to what you're saying about the slides, whenever they put the slides up on the government briefing, I can't see them. So I'm relying on their audio as to what they're saying. Sometimes they're so pale, but I can't tell what's on the slides. So if I want to know the information, I'm reliant on what I can hear. Or my mum with me going, oh, what you can see is, and she'd give me an audio description of what the charts are like and what the bit I want to know when they compare like regions. Or what I want to know, how it's affecting where I live. But I can't see it, so I'm reliant on someone else telling me, or just Googling what information I can find. I can't find it out in the same way that people might at that instant moment. And that's another small access issue, whereas you've got somebody who may be more visual, whether they would get it straight away. They'd be able to see it and understand it and process the information immediately. Whereas someone like me, it's a longer process because you can't see it. But yeah.
There was also controversy about shielding letters and how they were sent out in an inaccessible format as well, of any kind. It was just like a standard, one size fits all, when surely, you can't, again, if you're recognizing that you're getting the letter because of a health condition, surely it should just be marked down, well, this needs to be, in large print, or provide an audio version or something. Yeah. And it's just sort of, again, I just kind of don't understand, particularly that's just to do with health.
Yeah. I can't. You don't even get large print letters from an ophthalmology department where I go.
Oh my goodness, really?
They expect an audiology at the minute. They expect you to have phone call consultation before you have a face-to-face appointment. Audiology. The majority of people have got a really severe hearing loss, and they expect a phone call consultation to start with. To me, that's illogical.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
So let's come on to this. Is the final thing that I'd like us to talk about today in this. I'm sure the first of many. We should have our own podcast or television series. Or just give us a television series on Channel 4. We'll sort it all out. We were talking about leaving sort of adults that are almost like uneducatable, really, when it comes to some of these issues. And focusing on young people and children and an education point of view. Well, in fact, that is not strictly true, because when it comes to things like popular culture, it's actually quite a good way of being able to get people to think about things. I remember we did one around mental health a couple of years ago, where Julian Harrison, a colleague of mine, and I did a presentation to people that we invited, all of whom we knew were sort of mental health campaigners or people that had lived experience or worked with people, volunteered. And we ran through some popular myths around sort of television and films when it comes to mental health or disability. So, of course, every Bond villain has some kind of physical impairment. And we started talking about, but also we kind of got everybody in the room sort of on the same page, laughing, talking about it, sort of, how isn't this almost like the mimicry of what we're looking at? But then we kind of focused on some really good practice that people were doing by bringing people on set as advisors with things like Casualty, for example, when it was talking about sort of mental health. I'm thinking particularly around things like, EastEnders, Liz Carr appearing in a mainstream television show like Silent Witness, Adia Depatan being able to, travel the world and do a travel show. Do you think that things like popular culture has a role to play when it comes to exposing some of these things that you've just been talking about there, about sort of the illogicness of the fact that, an audiology department would want surely that's a comedy sketch, isn't it? Because that is the only way to explain to people the stupidness of what you've just said to them, I mean, what do you think from that point of view? Maybe start with Molly, and then we'll kind of end.
I think it's interesting. I think popular culture certainly has a role to play. It's how you manage it, I think, is the issue, and what sort of image you want to portray. Because I think I don't know about Sarah, but I get a little bit fed up with the big inspirational role that disabled people play before. And you can tell with the sarcasm in my voice there. But it just, I think that is a lot of the time, the portrayal in a lot of popular culture is the inspirational role. I mean, I'm a big fan of watching Strictly Come Dancing. I mean, in the past few years, they've had a couple of Paralympians, and I don't think it's brilliant, but they're able to adapt their role, they adapt to the dancing and what they do. But the word inspirational has been used for all of them. And whilst I love watching their dancing, I love to see how they work, they can compensate with their body and what they can do to like compensate the fact that they may have a half an arm. And it just, I feel very torn in that respect. I feel like it's presenting a very positive image, a good role model, and really, really positive, like I said. But then at the same side, on the flip side of it, I think the word inspirational is just used far too much. And
hero,
it's just,
hero as
yeah,
well.
hero, and exactly, thank you, that's
Brave.
exactly the word I was looking for. Brave, wonderful, you're striving through it fantastically, and it's just, it's finding that balance, and it's a very, very tricky balance to find. I really do find it difficult. And then it's like when you come to characterization and even fiction related, it's very difficult. You might get the villain image like you were just talking about, and then you get the hero, or you get the sympathy, sad, oh, he's so poor and he's not very well and he's so ill and he can't manage by himself. And it's just a pity, it's pittiness as well. I think pity comes out. Like, there's so many factors to balance to get what image do you want to project and what story do you want to tell. I think they're the main thing popular culture needs to think about.
So it's not asking popular culture to solve that or to provide the education. It's maybe it poses the questions that are then building on something else, which is a wider campaign by the government or charities, maybe all together. And then there's an educational program in schools. And again, what we're talking about here is it could take a generation or two in order for that to be educated that way, isn't it?
And then how do you actually get that across to people in an accessible way as well?
Well, I always think about people walking down the road throwing rubbish, and I'm thinking, well, keep Britain tidy. There's the biggest waste of time anybody ever had, because we're still throwing rubbish, and that was a campaign when I was a kid, and I'm 54. So hang on, for 40 years, people have been telling you to keep Britain tidy, and here we are still throwing rubbish on the floor. Where did we fail? But of course, not everybody is. And then how do you educate the ones that are? So, if people are empathetic to all the different types of people in society and access and disability in all of its broadest sense, then we tend not to think about the successes. We only tend to think about the negative extremes. I always think of Tanny Gray Thompson's sort of, being stranded on the train and not being able to get off. I mean, it's kind of really quite upsetting, high profile things. I mean, Sarah, from your point of view, popular culture, does it have a role to play, or do we give it too much freedom?
Well, no, I think definitely. I know we've had, I very much agree with Molly with you kind of like have your disability characters. So she said you've either got the inspirational Paralympian, the sort of super crip, I know is like kind of what a lot of sort of people in the disability community have called it. You've got the kind of a Tiny Tim kind of objective pity character. Then obviously you've got the scrounger aspect, which is kind of really often how a lot of people or somebody who doesn't try to overcome their disability and have that inspirational journey entirely and stuff. But I think definitely how disability is handled in pop culture is really, really important. I mean, like if you look at kind of things, I know that again we're still having these conversations, like in The Witches, like the film that's just come out, kind of the fact that the supervillain has like the kind of they've still kind of portrayed the hands as if like she has a disability, and it's that evil aspect, or people with facial scars are evil and everything. And
the new Bond villain, that kind of stuff.
Exactly,
So it's still there, isn't it?
It's still there, and I think it's really important. Well, it's great that obviously we're talking about this, but again, this is something that people are talking about. It's just the other people are still doing it as well, and I think that's really important. And obviously really with pop culture, obviously The Last Leg's great because they do talk about disability issues and kind of show the absurdity, and they also have the is it okay to ask segment, which is just great as well, just to ask those sort of questions and sort of rib people without disabilities as well, kind of gently with that as well. So I think it is definitely that fine line. It's just a really hard balance, but we need to have these conversations to be able to and make it obviously like 22% of people in the UK have a disability, so it should just be part of pop culture anyway. Like in every TV show there should be somebody with some form of disability in that TV show as a character. That should just be the way it is because it reflects society at large. And I think that's often where a lot of sort of pop culture doesn't catch up. And like, if there is a disabled character, there is the massive debate then, should a disabled actor portray them, or should it be an able-bodied character, a sort of actor who does? I mean, look at all the different Oscar wins for people who have portrayed somebody with a disability, like obviously Eddie Redmayne and such forth, and like Daniel Day-Lewis kind of with Left Leg many years back. So I think
do you think it's about timing? I mean, sort of race and, you know, interracial families, and off the back of Black Lives Matters and things like that, seems to have dominated the Christmas adverts between the main shopping producers, isn't it, at the moment? And then you've got the whole thing around LGBTQ actors playing those roles, and should people from those communities, and are sort of almost like being it's okay to be yourself now, sort of, you know, coming out and someone discovering someone's like that now. It seems to be much more accepted and mainstream. People don't react to it how they used to. Are we really still waiting for that moment to happen with disability, where suddenly it's not acceptable for someone without a disability to portray someone, and we need to push back against this kind of autism, Asperger's thing of, like, you know, well, they're kind of like superhumans in this way, but they just can't express themselves or understand what you're saying, but they're fantastic for running your business because they're like robots, and they're able to retain information like Rain Man, you know. So we're constantly challenging people, but I'm all up for challenging people, but we're not kind of then giving them the information afterwards, are we? You know what I mean? It's just not enough anymore to go, now go and have a look on, you know, Autism UK's website for more information. It's just, there needs to be something a little bit more there, doesn't there?
Yeah, we really do. We really do. I think like you said, we're still waiting for that element of disability to become more, I hate to use the word, but become more mainstream, or like become acceptable in every single way. It's like a lot of other, if you want to look at it, like you're saying, like looking at it from a race perspective or LGBT, a lot of other areas, like even women's perspective, I've almost like they come first, so to speak, in terms of looking at the quality dynamics. And then I personally feel like disability is always lagging behind in that respect. And it's not to say that the other elements aren't crucially important, because they really, really are. But I feel like with disability, we've got such a long way to go with it. And it's an interesting way to think about different kinds of actors. I knew of somebody a while ago who she's deaf, and she was an actor, I think, and she once got told you can't play a hearing person because you're deaf. And it's like, well, if you look at it like what Sarah was saying, we have people who are able-bodied, in quotation mark, playing disabled people, in quotation mark. So it's a really difficult one. It's like, you wouldn't ask, in today's age, you wouldn't go and ask a white person to go and play somebody else who's like might be Asian or black. But yet we think it's acceptable that somebody who's hearing could go play someone who's deaf. And I'm not saying I agree either way. I think it is a very difficult decision and a very difficult debate. It's just an interesting way to think about things.
Definitely. I mean, obviously, one of the big disability phrases amongst a lot of the community is "nothing about us without us," and I think that should just be a baseline as well. Like, I think definitely, you need to have the skills, and it's like, and also then to accurately portray kind of that role. I mean, having that sort of identity and everything, I think is it's just really important. But yeah, definitely, it's a long debate. I'm sure we can have another, as John just said, a very long discussion about
that thing of nothing about it without it. Like where I work, we're all deaf. We've all got different levels of hearing loss. We're all deaf women that run the charity specifically for and supporting deaf women. And I think that played a very crucial role. I think the organisation would be a very different organisation if it was a mixture of people that are deaf or hearing, or just a mixture of people that are hearing. It's just the diversity of levels of hearing loss and experience that we bring. We're a very small group, but I think that is a strength in our organisation and being able to deliver the work that we do. And that, taking that premise of nothing about us without us, and I think that works in some organisations really well. And some approaches, generally, it works.
I suppose, final comment from me, I guess, is that the interesting one about nothing about us without us, and what you were saying there about, you know, you're all being sort of deaf women or impacted by hearing loss, is the fact that if you were to turn around and say, look at this group of young black entrepreneurs, and people suddenly go, well, why can't I join them as a white entrepreneur? And you go, well, you're missing the point, okay? And then you've got someone over here who's running a gay organisation saying, well, people go, well, why can't I join if I'm straight? And it's like, well, no one's saying you can't join when you're straight. We've had to kind of come together because that's what we're fighting. You don't understand the mainstreamness of where you're talking from. You're in the mainstream, you're being represented. To turn around and say, well, actually, why can't I join your organisation if I can hear? You go, well, we're not saying that. What we're saying is, well, the reason we've all got together is because we've got a challenge where you are in the mainstream. So then again, I suppose that's men turning around. Well, why isn't there an International Men's Day? Isn't it? I mean, you're going down that road of, well, you're talking from a position of you're okay. You might think you're a victim and that you're oppressed, but let's face it, you're not really oppressed and a victim, are you? I mean, our experience of COVID-19 is very different from other places in the world. Are we really suffering? You know, there's a lot of inconvenience, but I'm not going to talk to you. I had a phone call from a radio station saying to me, John, you know, are you coping and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, yeah, I'm talking to you over the internet and my phone's working and I've got Netflix and I'm not putting my parents in a wheelbarrow and taking them down to Dover, paying a stranger to take them to France, and will we be accepted? So let's get it in context. You know, yeah, it's mildly inconvenient, but, you know, we're not in Syria. And I think this is what we need to be. We need to be pushing back against that and producing our own quality media content in order to own and shape the narrative about, you know, it's with us. Therefore, we're talking to you about that. And if you want to meet us halfway and have that conversation, then we're willing to. Well, listen, guys, I think that's been nearly over 45 minutes of us talking. That's been brilliant. Thank you very much, Molly, for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. It's been great.
Yeah. Sarah, happy with that?
Yeah, that's great. Definitely. I'm just really chuffed that, you know, we got Molly to speak and everything, and it's just great to get it down, because I think often, you know, we do have these discussions, but obviously amongst ourselves is one thing, but I think definitely sort of in it on video kind of hopefully you hope that if somebody watches even part of this, it might give them more of an idea and everything, and just sort of being able to see people with disabilities discussing it openly as well, and but not in a kind of inspirational kind of way or something.
Right. Well, we'll be putting this out on Facebook on Thursday for the International Day, 3rd of December.
Brilliant.
And I think also, Molly, from a personal point of view, as someone that, you know, is very interested in documentary films and all that sort of stuff, maybe another conversation with the three of us around documentaries around different types of disability will be quite good. We're kind of building up a sort of a resource list for people to watch and get in touch with us and have conversations. I think that would be great. So hopefully we'll see you again soon for something else. That'd be great.
Yeah, I can certainly talk a lot, as you probably noticed.
Brilliant. You're in esteemed company here. Thanks very much. See you soon.
Thank you.